novelist, burlesque performer, and former stripper on the adult entertainment strip in Baltimore, known as the world-famous Block. I'm thrilled and honored to participate in Workin the Tease, the art of Baltimore burlesque, and to be able to speak candidly about my experience working on the block in the last waning days of old-style burlesque, the 1970s. When I became a stripper on the block, at the tender age of 16, it was out of economic necessity. My family of origin had broken up, and I'd taken up with a very charismatic but unemployed older man, whose ex-wife had been a stripper at the old club Villanova on the block. In the heyday of the block, the 1940s and 50s, the Villanova was one of the finer clubs. It was a supper club. Couples would go there to dine and dance and take in the show. The block was burlesque central in those years. It was 3.5 to 4 city blocks of burlesque theaters, nightclubs, strip joints, places to eat, arcades, and pool halls. There was a Golden Gloves boxing gym located upstairs from the old club Troc, and midway down the 400 block of East Baltimore Street, a gypsy fortune teller shared a storefront with the infamous Tattoo Charlie. By the time I hit the block in the late 70s, the block had shrunk to about 1.5 to 2 blocks. But there were still more than 20 strip joints in continuous operation day and night. The Gaiety Theater was still called the Gaiety, but it operated as a bar rather than a theater. The Golden Gloves gym was still upstairs from the Troc, and the gypsy fortune teller and Tattoo Charlie were still there too. It was still in many ways its own circusy little world, and it was a very magical place for little old me, full of characters who seemed like they'd stepped right out of Damon Runyon's fiction. Fallen women, gangsters, gamblers, and the like. The place where I was taken to work by my boyfriend at the time was the Stage Door Bar. The Stage Door was located on Commerce Street, directly behind the old Gaiety Theater. Technically, it was part of the Gaiety Theater. It was housed within the rearmost portion of the building. Rumor about the Stage Door in the old days was that it had been a regular bar, and it was where Gaiety performers would go between shows to relax and drink. In those days, burlesque theaters showed 4 to 5 shows per day, with only maybe an hour in between each show. So the performers couldn't really go anywhere between shows. They just kind of hung around on the block and found themselves in places like the old Stage Door Bar, drinking and relaxing with their friends and co-performers, and maybe hooking up with one of their many admirers, known in those days as Stage Door Johnnies, hence the name Stage Door Bar. That little bit of block history was told to me as a teenage stripper working at the Stage Door, and many years later it made its way into my novel, These Days, which I describe as a glittery romp down memory lane on an historic burlesque strip, Baltimore's Block. The block was many things to me. First of all, it was a living. Like I said, I'd gotten there out of economic necessity. It was also a place that felt like home. I could identify with the people down there because I come from such a dysfunctional, broken home. And we were very tight-knit in those years. The manager of the Stage Door was a man named Milton Carter, who, by the 1970s when I showed up down there, was pushing 70 years old. He'd been on the block since the 1930s. He was like a grandfather to me, Milton was. He used to get on me about smoking cigarettes. He warned me to stay away from certain no-good men. And he told me on my very first day working at the Stage Door that I didn't have to do anything I didn't want to do. I think Milton gave me this advice because it helped him to sleep at night, but it was very important to hear that because there was vice aplenty on the block in those years. The block had, in fact, by the 1970s, gotten a bit sleazy. The legalization of hardcore porn in the late 60s meant that a lot of the theaters who used to show burlesque were now showing porno flicks. And it also meant that the burlesque queens, with their glittery wardrobes, fancy multi-panel gowns and feather boas were looking a little quaint in comparison to the hardcore porn that might be showing right next door. To keep pace with changing tastes, a lot of the clubs were offering fully nude shows, and many clubs had back rooms. Prostitution was not an uncommon occurrence on the block in the 1970s. But I like to point out that not every dancer down there was a prostitute. I, for one, did my best to simply turn a blind eye to the things that didn't set right with me, and did my best to make a living without turning tricks. But that was only one side of the block in the 1970s. The other side was the people. Like I said, many of the old burlesquers were still around in the 1970s, and it was still a very magical place, full of characters. Many of the old burlesquers were around simply because they had never done anything but work on the block. This was all they knew. Their skills were kind of limited to taking it off with flair and talking a good game at the bar. And that was what we did primarily, by the way. We hustled drinks at the bar. So you had to be a good talker to make a living on the block in those years. Well, these old burlesquers loved to rehash the good old days. And I was a very nostalgic teenager. I come from a broken, alcoholic home in which the good old days were always glorified over the much more chaotic present. So I soaked up those tales like a sponge. Now, everyone who's ever heard about the block has heard about Blaze Starr, its most famous stripper, and owner of the 2 O'Clock Club all through the 50s and 60s. Blaze sold the 2 O'Clock in 1975 and retired pretty wealthy, or so I understand. I never actually had the chance to meet her. I didn't show up until 1978, 3 years after she'd gone. But she lived on through the tales told to me by people who did know her, the old burlesquers that I worked with day in and day out. But not every old burlesquer was as famous or as fortunate as Blaze. Many were celebrities, but only on a local level. They got their names printed in the entertainment sections of the local papers every week as featured entertainers on Baltimore's block. But they weren't famous like Blaze, and they didn't draw the big paychecks. They were hard luck stories primarily, just like me. They were eking out a living, and they were very relatable by me. Two that come to mind especially are Pam Gale of the Oasis nightclub and Bootsy McCullough, Boots' Show Bar. These were women who were local celebrities all through the 50s and 60s as strippers on the block. They were still around on the block when I showed up in '78. They each owned a club. And they were very nostalgic for the good old days, just like Milton Carter was. They loved to tell those tales about the days when the block was Burlesque Central and Blaze was known as mayor of the block. So I'd like to talk about how I came to be what I consider a preservationist and practitioner of old-style burlesque. Shortly after arriving on the block, I shed the boyfriend. I figured if I could bring in $400 to $500 a week working as a stripper, what did I need him for? And I started hanging out at a place called the Midway Bar. The Midway was, and still is, in the 400 block of Baltimore Street. It was and is a regular bar. No strippers in there, they just serve drinks. But the special thing about the Midway is that they have a very extensive collection of old stripper publicity photos from the 40s through the 60s. There are many publicity shots of Blaze, but there are many others as well, and it always seemed to me that anyone who ever found themselves working as a feature entertainer in a burlesque club on Baltimore Street had a chance of having their memory preserved on the walls of the Midway Bar. It's a very extensive collection and well worth taking a peek at. Now, the first time I saw those photos, I was entranced. I had never seen women posing so glamorously, wearing these skimpy yet very flashy and glittery costumes. It was not par for the course for what you would find on Baltimore Street in the 1970s. It was different. It was more glamorous, more classy. Well, I decided upon seeing those photos that was how I would like to represent myself as a stripper. So I went down to a place called Kent's on Broadway. That was a supplier of dancer costumes back in those years. And they still carried full-length gowns. They weren't custom-made, they were factory-made, but they sufficed. Kent's also carried gloves and boas. So I went and bought myself a couple of gowns, a couple pairs of gloves, and I went about trying to present myself as the women in the photos at the Gaiety. At the Midway had presented themselves. And this caught the eye of a lady named Betty, who was the bartender at the stage door while I was working there as a stripper. Betty had been around on the block in the 50s and the 60s. She had worked as a stripper at the old Club 408. And she, like all of the rest of the old burlesquers that I knew in those years, loved to rehash the good old days. And this is what we would spend our time doing when there weren't a lot of customers in the bar. We would sit around chatting it up, bringing up the good old days. So Betty noticed that I was starting to dress a little bit differently, a little more classy. And she told me about the routine that she used to do when she was working at the strip at the 408. It was a stocking peel routine, and what she would do was take a bar stool and place it on the stage and perch on it to peel her stocking. It would have gone something like this. First I have to peel a glove. Perch on the bar stool, strike a pose, kick the legs up, kick off the shoes. Bring the legs back up and start the stocking peel. Slowly, teasingly. Bring it up the leg, over the heel, and hook it on the toe. Work it between the legs a little bit. We were, after all, trying to turn on men in those years. So there's my stocking peel, a la Betty at the stage door. So after Betty described for me her stocking peel routine, I started incorporating it into my own routine. Now in those days, I was in the habit of doing 2 songs standing and 1 lying down on the floor using a bearskin rug. That was known as a floor show back then. My first number would be something peppy that I could get the audience going with. The second one would be more slow and seductive, something that I could do a nice bumping walk to. And the third was the floor show routine. Well, after Betty told me how to do a stocking peel, I started incorporating a stocking peel into my floor show routine. And I did this every time I got up on stage to dance at the stage door. And as far as I know, I was the only stripper on the block in those years that still peeled stockings. I didn't know of anyone else who had done it, who was doing it, or even heard of anyone who was doing it. It was just me, and that became my trademark. So thank you, Betty, for teaching me how to do a stocking peel. Now, the other huge influence on me from the old burlesque arena was Miss Christie. Lynn was truly the last real stripper left on the block in the 1970s and 80s, by virtue of, first of all, of her wardrobe. She had a full burlesque wardrobe, custom-made gowns with multiple layers, matching feather boas, so they were tulle boas actually, but she had them in every color imaginable to match all of her gowns, and matching shoes. And each of these get-ups cost Lynn upwards of $500 each, so she invested a considerable sum to maintain a tradition, and she deserves a tip of the hat for that. Here's to you, Lynn. And secondly, Lynn was the last real stripper left on the block in the 70s and the 80s by virtue of the fact that she still traveled. She had a friend who was an old carnival producer, and he would book her to work on carnival midway shows throughout the South, as well as nightclub and burlesque theater gigs all across the United States and in Canada. So by virtue of those 2 things, Lynn truly was the last real stripper left on the block. She worked on the block all through the 1980s. And And this, by the way, is one of her boas. Like I said, she had them in every color imaginable. She gave me this one because she wasn't crazy about pink, but also because she knew I would use it well. And I have used it well, by the way. I stripped with it all throughout my stripping career in the 1980s, and I've used it many times in new burlesque shows throughout the past year. So I met Lynn when she was working at the Stage Door Bar. She actually worked predominantly for Pam Gale at the Oasis nightclub. She was Pam's protege. But every once in a while she would get into a little hissy fit with Pam and come to work at the Stage Door. And I say that with the utmost reverence because Lynn is queen with a capital Q. She knows herself, and hissy fits are something she's very capable of. But I was mesmerized the first time I saw her at the Stage Door. First of all, she was beautiful. She was redheaded with a baby face, 38, 22, 38, very shapely. But it went beyond mere looks. The thing that was so impressive about Lynn was her attitude. She had this way of carrying herself that said, I am first rate. And she had a walk that was the sexiest walk I had ever seen. She had only to walk across the stage, and every eye in the place would follow her. So I'd like to demonstrate for you Lynn Christie's walk. It went like this. One foot in front of the other, very slow, very sexy, hands on hips, head held high, strike a pose, give a bump. The first time I saw Lynn do that, I was mesmerized. She was quite a lady. She's the lady that I consider to be my mentor, and she got the dedication in my book. And I'm very reluctant to ever replace her with another mentor. If you knew her, you would understand that. So now, the items on display. First of all, this is me. It's circa 1985. I was blonde in those years. Lynn was a redhead, I was a blonde. I'm wearing Lynn's gown. She had booked me via her friend, the carnival producer, to work at a theater in Richmond, Virginia, in which I would be required to wear a full burlesque gown. And I didn't really have a full burlesque gown. I had some factory-made gowns, but I didn't really have anything that constituted full burlesque. So she lent me several of her gowns and several boas, and then we took some publicity photos. This is one of them. The turquoise-colored skirt that's on display came to me via Lynn. It had belonged to Pam Gale. It dates to about 1950, and that was one of Pam's burlesque accoutrements. Once upon a time, Lynn had also gifted me a gown that belonged to Pam Gale. It was a beautiful, full-length white gown with sequins on it the size of quarters. It was truly spectacular. When I moved out to Denver from Baltimore, I left it behind and with the intention of going back for it. And when I went back for it, I discovered that my mom had thrown it away. I was devastated. I was like, but Mom, that belonged to Pam Gale. And she was like, Pam who? Like I said, many of Baltimore Street's burlesquers were legends only on Baltimore Street. But they were legends for me, and they are still. So here's to Betty for teaching me a stocking heel. Here's to Lynn Christie for teaching me class with a capital C. And thanks very much to the Maryland Institute College of Art for putting together this vital exhibit. Burlesque is an important piece of American entertainment history, and it should be preserved. Thanks also to the New Year burlesque community for bringing striptease up out of the closet.